Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at how crowds think.
Okay.
And this is based on this fascinating book on crowd psychology
Oh,
that we've been digging into. And it's amazing how many insights there are into how crowds behave and how beliefs kind of spread through these groups.
yeah, it is really interesting how crowds can act in such unpredictable ways. But then when you start to look at it from the psychological perspective, you start to see there are these patterns.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why they do the things that they do.
One of the things that really struck me right at the beginning was this comparison the book makes between the imagination of a crowd and a dream state,
Mm.
and how it's not just vivid,
Mm.
like a dream, but really powerful and almost like easily excited.
Right, like how quickly things can shift.
Exactly.
I think that's a really apt comparison because just like in a dream state, crowds, they tend to gravitate towards the improbable, the things that are really sensational. The legendary things. It's not so much about hard facts or rationality,
Right.
but it's more about the power of these images and stories.
Well, that makes me think about bread and circuses, right? We always hear that phrase, referring back to ancient Rome, but
Yeah,
doesn't that still hold true today? I mean, think about reality TV.
of course.
Or, these huge blockbuster action movies.
Yeah.
It's like we're still so drawn to those spectacles, those like larger than life things.
We love to escape.
Yeah, it's almost like this primal need
It
to
is.
just kind of like get swept up in something.
Yeah, well, and the author of this book, he actually brings up a really fascinating historical example to illustrate this point.
Okay.
He talks about how theater audiences used to react to villains back in the day.
Oh, wow.
People would get so riled up that they would literally try to attack the actor playing the villain.
No way.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It really shows you how crowds blur the lines between reality and illusion,
Right.
especially when they're confronted with such a powerful image or performance.
So if crowds can get like that so quickly,
Yeah.
so susceptible to these strong images, and what does that mean when it comes to, the potential for influence or even manipulation? That's kind of a
Yeah.
scary thought.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about because it suggests that those who really understand the power of imagery and storytelling,
Right.
they have a huge advantage when it comes to swaying a crowd. And there's actually a quote from this book that really sent chills down my spine when I read it.
Oh, real?
It says, "Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim."
Wow.
Pretty powerful stuff.
That's intense.
Mm.
It makes me think about figures like Napoleon.
Oh, yeah.
He was a master at using imagery and really playing on public perception to build his power.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Napoleon's a perfect example. He understood the importance of symbols, grand ceremonies, even just creating this larger-than-life persona for himself.
Right.
And all of that fed directly into the public imagination,
Yeah.
made him this incredibly compelling figure.
And didn't he also like strategically use religion to gain support in different regions?
Yes.
It's almost like he was tailoring his image
He was.
to fit the specific beliefs of whoever he was trying to.
He was a master manipulator for sure.
Yeah.
He recognized the power of these belief systems and how they can take on this almost religious quality.
Oh, interesting.
It's about that fervor, that intolerance of opposing views, and that inherent need to spread the belief. It's really quite a powerful force.
Yeah, it's almost like they take on a life of their own, don't they?
Absolutely.
These beliefs once they get going.
Uh,
And that idea of leaders tapping into this almost religious kind of devotion in crowds.
Yep.
I mean, that leads us to another point in the book that I thought was really interesting. It seems like the way that crowds form beliefs, especially around these powerful figures,
Hmm.
it's not always based on, logic or reason.
You're absolutely right. The book really digs into this, and it argues that crowds aren't primarily swayed by logic or reason. They're driven by emotions, by associations, and by those powerful images we were just talking about.
So instead of, carefully analyzing the facts or weighing different arguments, they're making these leaps of faith almost.
Yeah.
Like they're connecting the dots based on gut feeling more than cold, hard logic.
Precisely. It's more about the feeling that a leader or an idea evokes, not necessarily the factual basis behind it. The author uses this really interesting analogy.
Right.
He talks about ice and glass
Okay.
and how they're both transparent. So someone might assume that glass, like ice, will melt in their mouth,
Oh, wow.
which of course isn't true, but it shows how crowds often jump to conclusions based on just these surface level similarities.
Right, like judging a book by its cover,
Exactly.
but on a massive scale
Right.
with huge consequences
There's never
potentially.
consequences. Yeah, especially in today's world, where information or misinformation and these really eye-catching images, they spread so fast.
It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how often we're bombarded with these images and slogans that are designed to just trigger an immediate emotional response. It's
Mhm.
like they bypass our critical thinking altogether.
Yeah. They do. And the book really emphasizes this point by talking about how ineffective long drawn out speeches are when it comes to influencing a crowd.
Right.
You can have the most logically sound argument in the world,
Yeah.
but if it doesn't capture the imagination, if it doesn't have that emotional hook, it's going to fall flat.
So it's less about appealing to the intellect and more about tapping into those emotions, those kind of like primal instincts almost.
Exactly. The author argues that the speaker who can conjure up vivid mental images and evoke strong emotional responses is going to be way more persuasive than the one who relies on just logic and reason.
It's fascinating. It's almost like we're hardwired to be drawn in by a good story or a captivating image or even just like a larger than life personality.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder how much of our own beliefs, even outside of a crowd setting, are shaped by these unconscious influences.
That's a great question, and I think it speaks to the importance of cultivating critical thinking skills. Because if we're not aware of these psychological mechanisms at play, we're just so much more vulnerable to manipulation, whether we're part of a massive crowd or just scrolling through our social media feeds.
So if crowds are so susceptible to appearances, to these emotional appeals,
Yeah.
how can we as individuals become more discerning? How do we avoid being swept up in these tides of emotion and imagery and all of that?
Well, it starts with recognizing our own biases,
Yeah.
understanding how our minds can be swayed by these tactics, and then developing a healthy skepticism towards information that's presented in an overly simplistic or emotionally charged way.
Right. It's like questioning those gut reactions.
Exactly.
Asking yourself, am I really getting the whole picture here?
Are you looking at it from all sides?
Yeah, it's like we need to train ourselves to be less reactive and a little more analytical.
Yeah.
But is this really just a crowd phenomenon?
Mm.
Or do these same patterns apply even in smaller groups? Or even when we're by ourselves?
That's a really important point. The book actually emphasizes that these tendencies, they aren't limited to just these big, faceless crowds. Even in small groups, even as individuals, we can fall prey to these same patterns of thinking, especially when our emotions are running high.
So it's not just about mobs in the streets or, those huge rallies.
Mhm.
This applies to how we form opinions, how
Mm.
we react to things with our family, among our friends, even in the quiet of our own minds.
Exactly.
That's kind of nerving when you think about it.
It is, but that's why understanding these underlying psychological mechanisms, they're so important.
Mm.
Whether we're in a crowd or on our own, it's the first step to becoming more aware and intentional about the choices that we make.
So let's bring it all together. What are some of the big takeaways from our deep dive into crowd psychology today?
Well, I think we've seen just how powerfully images can influence a crowd's beliefs and how susceptible crowds are to these strong leaders who understand that dynamic, and then how often those beliefs that they hold take on this almost religious fervor,
Yeah.
demanding absolute devotion and refusing to tolerate any dissent.
Yeah, it's a little unsettling to realize just how easily we can be swayed, you know,
Yeah.
whether it's by appearances or a good story or a charismatic personality. I know I'm going to be looking at things a little differently now.
I think that's the whole point.
Yeah.
It's a call to be more aware, more conscious of all these forces that are constantly at play shaping our beliefs and actions.
So to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question. If crowds and even individuals are so easily swayed by appearances, how can we cultivate this more critical mindset, a more discerning eye? How do we avoid being manipulated by all these, carefully crafted images and narratives that are out there?
It's definitely a challenge, but I think by understanding these psychological tendencies, by questioning our own assumptions, by actively seeking out different perspectives, we can become more discerning, more resilient, and ultimately more in control of our own beliefs and our own actions.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's giving you some new insights and maybe inspired you to think a little differently about the world around you and even about yourselves. Until next time.